Kia ora, welcome to this session. We are looking at the Find It, Fix It primary survey, and in some respects it's a recap. So it's a process that we introduced into the degree in 2020. It's been comprehensively covered in year one, but I understand for some distance students that may have involved limited exposure to it at this point. So we're just going to go through and recap, firstly, the model of practice that sits behind the Find It, Fix It primary survey, and secondly, the components of it. So the primary survey has traditionally been considered a relatively simple and basic skill that gets undertaken by paramedics. However, the longer we have spent teaching it and observing what is involved, we've come to the realization that it's more complex than we first thought. Now, over time, educators have operated on the principle that if we just gave students the anatomical and the physiological principles of the airway, the respiratory system, and the circulatory system, then students are going to be able to apply these to whatever situation they're facing and deduce what to do or to improvise their way out of any issues that face them. In reality, the more we read about how the human brain operates in crisis situations, the more convinced that we are that this simply just doesn't work. Now, this is for a number of reasons, and I'll go through both of these shortly. But the first of them is because of limited exposure to the situations in which we would look to have to solve issues. And secondly, the degree of cognitive processing capacity that's available to us, especially in a crisis situation. So first, let's look at this limited exposure. Now, what I'm going to tell you is a bit of a rough estimate, but I don't think it's unfair. We might assume that most unconscious patients are going to be in that 1 or 2% of patients that we see who are considered to have an immediately life-threatening issue. So even if this accounted for 2% of all the paramedic workload, and if we think that an urban-based paramedic might attend maybe 20 patients during a shift round and does 40 complete shift rounds in a year, that means they're going to see somewhere between 8 and 1,600 patients a year. So to be on the safe side, let's bump this number up to maybe 2,000 patients a year. And if 2% of these 2,000 patients are the ones that are going to have these primary survey issues, it means that a paramedic is going to see 20 patients a year with an immediately life-threatening issue. So what we're talking about is less than 2 patients a month. So I guess the question we ask ourselves is, how many patients do I have to see, or how long do I have to be doing this to become an expert? And particularly if I'm only doing something 20 times a year, is that going to happen? There used to be a widely accepted rule of thumb that told us that expertise was gained after 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. So one's going to assume it will take a long time to become a primary survey expert without supplementing the limited exposure that we get on the road. And we're going to have to somehow build this up with simulation exercises that might help develop this expertise. In reality, this 10,000 hour rule is very arbitrary, and there's other research that says as little as 1,600 hours would suffice. But that gaining expert status is actually always going to require more than just exposure. So even if the 1,600 hours was enough, attaining that amount of practice is still going to take a long, long time. If you spend doing these skills for 30 minutes with all critically ill patients, you're still going to need to see somewhere around 3,200 status 1 patients, or about 40 years worth of patients that require these interventions to become an expert. So if all sounds doom and gloom, there are rays of sunshine in all this. Effective mental practice with some mentoring and an understanding of both your personal and the clinical goals amplify the effect of the exposure that we get, or the number of patients we see, or the number of hours we do in terms of gaining expertise. I think the point I'm trying to get to here is that if we solely rely on road time to get better at performing a primary survey, then we're not going to get enough opportunities to become experts. So instead, we're going to have to utilize these roles of mental practice, find ourselves good mentors, and make sure that we understand both our personal and our clinical goals when we start to apply these skills. So if we think we can use mental rehearsal skills, some mentoring and goal setting to help us become experts, the second thing we need to look at is cognitive processing. The cognitive process is the thinking, the knowing, the remembering, the judging, and the problem solving that we apply to particular situations. And if you think about it, these are the cognitive skills required in a clinical situation. In other words, the ability to recognize a problem, recall important information about that, judge the value of that information, and tailor an appropriate response, and then evaluate the result and rethink about any changes or improvements that can be made. I say it like that and it makes it sound simple, but in reality it isn't. And when it comes to complex tasks, this can take a long time to develop. And you think back to when you were learning to drive, for instance, and how much work and effort it seemed to be at the time, but I'm assuming by now everyone's pretty much an expert at it. The capacity to be able to use all these mental skills is not static. So there's sometimes when we're working through problems where it might seem quite easy to do it. It might be that the problem isn't complex and that not much memory or problem solving is required. Or it might involve a task that you're very familiar with and you can recall several ways to problem solve. Driving would be a great example. Or it might have been that you've made some time and some space so that there aren't any competing interests, thoughts, or interruptions. And you might use these sort of strategies when you're studying, for instance. This last point is quite critical because in clinical practice, it can be really difficult to find this time and space. And researchers have recognised that paramedics deal with multiple needs at any given time. Now, this might include a patient who's got multiple injuries or have an illness that requires several procedures to be conducted more or less at the same time. And at the same time, have to manage family members, manage bystanders, work and cooperate with crewmates or with other emergency service workers. Alongside all of this happening, seeing and hearing critically ill and distressed people is also likely to initiate stress responses in us. That's the way we're wired. And these stress responses can impact on our capacity to process information. So this brings us to the point of cognitive processing capacity, which relates to the amount of information that our working memories can hold at any one time. As a rule of thumb, the brain prefers to operate in an effortless, less time-consuming System 1 thinking. Or in other words, it's going to rely on intuition to make decisions and involve analysis of large amounts of data unless we've been specifically trained to do this. Hence this lecture. If you think about it, driving is a very complex skill and it requires processing multiple inputs from the car, from the road, and from other traffic. But we take all this in, we process it, we compare it with our previous memories, and we project a likely outcome and enact a course of action based on that thinking. And when an emergency occurs, we can take decisive action. But at that particular time, we're not thinking about what's on our shopping list. Now think again about how long it took you to learn how to drive and the changes that you might have made to your driving style over the last few years. I'm just asking you to compare this to the amount of time you spend doing primary surveys and any modifications you might have made to that skill. In a crisis situation such as a medical emergency, people are swamped with incoming information which they're going to have to filter and decide which is most important. At times, paramedics can feel completely overwhelmed and may not be able to utilize the information or retain enough information in their short-term memory, and it might cause them to either become caught in some sort of crisis loop, that's where we repeat the same action but don't get a change in outcome, or we might freeze completely. Typically, experts use subconscious processes that can confound observers. Researchers have concluded that what experts use as mental models that help focus on essential information, map this to a desired outcome, and select and run feasible strategies to achieve these outcomes. While gaining experience by encountering situations is an essential element of developing and practicing the physical and cognitive skills, It is vital that we mentally rehearse these so that they become part of a subconscious routine and are less likely to be overwhelmed by the amount of incoming information. It also assists in being able to filter that information and focus on the most important elements. When students were faced with something unexpected and complex, which results in rapid patient deterioration, the fifth array of tutors have observed that students, some of which are full-time paramedics with a few years' experience, can become overwhelmed and frozen. Basically, their short-term memory or their RAM becomes overloaded with too many requests. They then revert back to what they know best. And if what they know is taking blood pressures and temperatures, collecting patients' medications, radioing communication centres to see how far their backup is away, and then retaking another blood pressure and so on, they will perform all of these non-vital tasks while the critical assessment and the critical treatments, which could save the patient, are not being performed. However, on the other hand, experts have created and stored these mental models in their long-term memory, that is, say, their hard drive as opposed to their RAM, and they can rapidly access this during a crisis. The mental models that we need and the cognitive capacity we need to run them comes from mental rehearsal as well as physical rehearsal of the skills to the point that they become our fallback position. So when we're in a crisis situation, when we're at risk of being overwhelmed by the amount of incoming information and the need to get on with things, these are the routines that we'll fall back onto. So this brings us to the find it, fix it model. We added the clock to the poster just to remind you that this needs to be quick, but it also needs to be accurate. And it has a first sweep, which was checking for the presence of life. Essentially, at the end of the day, we're asking the question, do I need to start CPR or control any catastrophic breathing? So we're asking you to come in, see if you can hear or see any dangers, and check the patient's response, and that we position the patient using the open airway or the head tilt method so that we can easily check for breathing and simultaneously check for a pulse to confirm that the patient's in cardiac arrest. If there are clear signs that the patient's in cardiac arrest and no signs of life, it is possible to jump straight over this step and go straight to high performance CPR. This all seems self-evident, but at times it can benefit from some reflection. Tunnel vision can blind any of us, and I mean any of us, to the wider picture. And when it comes to cognitive processing capacity, this is going to become more likely in emergency situations. At any point in the paramedic career spectrum, using reflection skills after a case can be beneficial. When we've stepped back from the case and we're reflecting on our work, it's so much easier to take this step back and reevaluate what the goals were, whether they were the appropriate goals for the situation, and how well our actions and behaviour have served these goals. The model of practice we're using from the supplementary poster is for an event-driven process. It's the process we use to establish whether or not the patient is in cardiac arrest and what we would do about it. As I said, it was developed for the on-campus cohort who have limited exposure to the clinical world, and it might be easy to glance at this and move straight on. I believe it's more beneficial to review this as decision-making from a paramedic perspective when your responsibilities are more likely to extend to a leadership role and where you are more accountable for connecting the dots between the information that's coming in and the steps that need to be taken next. So, if there's any doubt that the patient's in cardiac arrest, position the patient to complete those checks for pulse and breathing. And if the patient is unresponsive or has absent or abnormal breathing and no pulse, then we start high performance CPR. The information gathering phase that has to happen during this stage needs to be considered as well. So we have to think about the patient's wishes, the information that relates to the viability or futility of a cardiac arrest, and then reconsider the cause of the cardiac arrest to work out whether we're going to stay in high performance CPR or whether we're going to shift to a hypoxic arrest algorithm. The remainder of the Find It, Fix It survey is an event-driven, drilled approach that requires a lot of automated system one responses. The goal we're trying to do is work out whether there's an issue with the airway, breathing or circulation, or whether the patient falls into what we call the big sick category. This helps with our initial management because the poster provides some decision making by proxy in terms of the treatments and what we're looking for out of them, as well as helping with this prioritization of tasks once the primary survey is completed. On the other hand, if we make our way through this chart and there's no issues that come up, you're likely to have a lot more time to work out what is happening with the patient. They're going to be in the little sick category, and our subsequent task prioritization may well be different. So just to recap that, the clinical goal of the primary survey is to work out whether we need some immediate life-saving interventions and whether the patient falls into the big sick category or not. We will be able to rehearse some of these skills during the block courses. But in the short term, to test your knowledge of the find it, fix it, here's a couple of questions you might want to consider. Firstly, how many assessment elements are there in the find it phase for the airway? Just even knowing how many can help remember the various steps that you have to go through to complete the assessment phase. And if I'm recapping the airway phase with my partner and I use the word patent, what does that mean? Is that something the patient's done? Is that something I've done? How am I going to explain airway status? How many assessment elements are there in the fix it phase for breathing? And lastly, how many assessments are there in the find it, fix it phase for circulation? A patient who has a heart rate of 30 beats a minute. What are the other elements in the primary survey that tell me I have a big sick patient? And should I have an asthmatic patient with a wheeze who is very pale, what tells me whether I should sit them up or lie them down? I'll leave you to work through some responses to those questions. But before I finish up on this, I just wanted to run through a couple of important points about primary surveys in general. When performing the find it, fix it, or any other model of primary survey, there's a certain amount of information that we don't want to have to deal with. Postponing these investigations will buy us time to perform life-saving interventions without becoming distracted. And just to reiterate a few things that we've been dealing with in terms of crisis and complex situations. We know that exposure is very important to moving towards expertise, but we know that without the use of mental models and goal setting, that's going to be quite difficult. There's a number of ways of looking at the models of practice that you might want to organise your thinking around, and here's a couple that have proved useful to students in the past. For example, a former student sketched out this circular or spiral version of the model, which appealed more to him. Now, this particular version incorporates 3 sweeps. So there's that primary sweep, which is represented on the find it, fix it as determining whether the patient's in cardiac arrest or has a catastrophic bleed. And then moves on to a second sweep, which completes the other A, B, C components of the find it, fix it model. And finally, they move on to a series of investigations that gives them the information they require for their respiratory, circulatory, and neurological status assessments. Here's another look at the same process. It's just using a slightly different outline. Whichever of these makes the most sense to you, that will be the one you should be using. I'll leave you at this point and we will discuss this further and run these exercises when I see you on the block course. Ka kite.